Picture a city street in the age of horse traffic, coal smoke, and crowded tenements. The road is wet, but not from rain alone. Ash blows from doorways. Rotting scraps sit in corners. Broken crates, spoiled vegetables, dead rats, and piles of manure mix into a layer of filth that never seems to leave for long. In summer, the smell hangs in the air. In winter, the mess freezes, then returns when the thaw comes. Children run past it. Vendors work beside it. Families eat a few feet away from it. And all of it keeps growing, day after day, because the city has become very good at one thing and very bad at another. It knows how to pack people together. It does not yet know how to deal with what all those people throw away. If strange stories hidden inside ordinary objects are your kind of thing, subscribe now. Because this one starts in the gutter and ends with one of the quiet tools that made modern city life possible. The problem was simple. Every person produced waste. Every home produced waste. Every shop produced waste. And once towns turned into large industrial cities, that waste stopped being a small private annoyance and became a public threat. Food scraps brought flies. Animal waste drew insects and soaked into the streets. Coal ash coated steps, windowsills, and lungs. Old rags and paper caught fire easily. Standing piles of mixed garbage gave rats a feast. The more crowded the neighborhood, the worse it got. For most of human history, people could get rid of waste in ways that worked well enough for smaller communities. They burned some of it. They fed scraps to pigs or dogs. They tossed refuse into pits, fields, streams, vacant ground, or the nearest space that seemed to belong to nobody. In a village, trash could disappear into distance, soil, animals, or time. A packed city gave waste no such escape. What had once been pushed aside now stayed close. Very close. That changed the meaning of garbage itself. It was no longer just unwanted stuff. It became a daily test of whether a city could survive its own success. And the waste was not one neat thing. That made the problem even harder. A household in the 19th century might throw out vegetable peelings, bones, broken pottery, lamp fragments, soot, coal ash, straw, dirty paper, and all kinds of scraps that did not fit any category. In some neighborhoods, the heaviest part was ash from heating and cooking. In others, food waste spoiled fastest and smelled worst. Some materials could be sold, reused, burned, or fed to animals. Some could not. The line between rubbish and resource was blurry. One person's garbage might still have value to a scavenger, a rag picker, or a pig keeper. So people kept using habits that felt normal to them. A family might sweep waste into the street and assume carts, rain, animals, or city workers would deal with it. A shop owner might leave refuse out back and hope it stayed out of sight. A landlord might ignore the mess so long as tenants kept paying rent. And city officials often moved slowly, partly because organized sanitation cost money, and partly because many people still saw garbage as a private matter. But private waste did not stay private for long. When loose trash hit the street, it became everybody's problem. Think about what that looked like in practical terms. A gust of wind could spread ash across an entire block. Dogs could tear open piles of scraps in minutes. Rats could move from one heap to the next all night. Flies did not care which family had produced the waste. Fire did not care which building had thrown out the wrong materials. Disease did not stop at one doorstep. Even when city leaders did not yet understand germs in the modern sense, they understood enough to fear filth, foul air, stagnant waste, and rotting matter. They could see that dirty streets and crowded housing made each other worse. And there was another problem hiding inside the first one. Loose waste is hard to remove, very hard. A pile on the ground spills, spreads, leaks, and mixes with whatever is already there. Workers have to shovel it by hand. Animals drag pieces away. Rain turns it into sludge. Wheels crush it into the street. More wastelands on top. What begins as one family's daily trash turns into part of the city itself. That is where the real importance of the trash can begins, not as a symbol, not as a household accessory, as a container, a barrier, a way to stop waste from immediately becoming loose urban matter. Today that sounds almost too obvious to mention. Put garbage in a bin, close the lid, wait for collection. But obvious ideas often arrive late, especially when they ask millions of people to change their habits at home. At first, many people did not want this new step in daily life. They did not want a can inside or near the house. They did not want to pay for one. They did not want to store filth even temporarily beside a door, in a hall, or in a yard. Some thought it would smell worse. Some thought it would attract pests. Some saw it as one more demand from officials who already wanted to inspect, regulate, and fine them. Others simply stuck with what they knew because that was easier. And if you had grown up in a world where ash was dumped one way, scraps another way, and useful leftovers passed to animals or peddlers, a single household container might not look like progress. It might look like trouble. Would you have trusted it? If a city told you to keep your waste in a metal can near your building until collection day, would that have sounded cleaner? Or would it have sounded like storing a problem right next to your home? That resistance mattered because cities could not clean the streets effectively unless waste was contained first. No matter how many carts a city bought, no matter how many workers it hired, it would keep losing the battle if trash reached the road already scattered, soaked, crushed, and picked apart by animals. Urban sanitation needed a small change at the household level to make the larger system possible. Waste had to stop traveling loose. That was the first quiet revolution. Not the truck, not the landfill, not the sanitation department in uniform. The humble idea that garbage should sit inside something rather than all over everything. It seems small because the object itself is small. But that small step helped separate daily life from daily contamination. It gave cities a chance to collect waste in regular amounts, from regular places, at regular times. Without that, the street remained the default container, and a street packed with loose garbage could never stay healthy for long. So the real turning point did not begin with the road. It began at the doorstep, where people were first asked to change an old habit and trust a container they did not even want near them. That doorstep change sounds easy from a modern point of view. Put waste in a container, wait for collection. Problem solved. But for the people being asked to do it, the change did not feel simple at all. It felt awkward, dirty, expensive, and in some cases insulting. The trash can was not entering a world with clean kitchens, sealed plastic bags, and predictable pickup schedules. It was entering a world where waste had many different uses, many different paths, and many different meanings. That is why so many people resisted it at first. One reason was smell. A family could tolerate the quick act of throwing scraps outside, burning some refuse, or handing part of it off to animals or collectors. Keeping the waste close for hours or days felt completely different. Food scraps spoiled fast. Ash clung to everything. Damp rubbish turned sour. Even a sturdy can could seem like a box full of odor sitting beside daily life. To a modern viewer, the container looks like the clean option. To many households back then, it looked like a way to trap filth near the home instead of getting rid of it. Cost mattered too. A proper can was not just an idea. It was an object someone had to buy, place, clean, and replace. Wealthier households could absorb that more easily. Poorer families often lived with less space, less control over their buildings, and less money to spend on anything that did not clearly improve survival. If you already struggled to pay rent, coal, food, and clothing bills, a metal waste can might feel like one more burden invented by people who did not live the way you did. And if the city expected compliance but did not provide containers, resistance was almost guaranteed. Space was another issue. Middle-class reformers often imagined tidy homes and orderly yards. Many city residents did not live like that. They lived in crowded apartments, boarding houses, narrow alleys, shared courtyards, and packed tenements where privacy was thin and storage space was thinner. In those places, where exactly was the can supposed to go? Near the back stairs? In the hallway? By a shared entrance? In a tiny yard used by several families? Every option created new friction. A bin that seems harmless in a detached house could become a daily argument in a building full of tenants. There was also the matter of habit, and habit is stronger than reformers like to admit. People do not only throw things away, they build routines around waste. Those routines often make sense inside the older system. Scraps went to pigs, rags went to dealers, bones, bottles, paper, and metal might be saved, sold, reused, or passed along. Ash might be dumped separately because households produced so much of it, and because it behaved differently from wet kitchen refuse. The modern idea of mixing everything called trash into a single stream was not yet natural. Many families saw no reason to place all these different leftovers into one can just because city officials said they should, and not everyone looking at a heap of refuse saw only refuse. Rag pickers, scavengers, junk dealers, and poor laborers often depended on city waste. They sorted value out of what others ignored. Old cloth, scrap metal, bottles, bones, and paper could all move back into the economy. This did not mean the old system was clean or safe. It often was not. But it did mean that waste was tied to livelihoods. Once garbage went into containers and into more organized municipal systems, access changed. What had once been loose and available became controlled, timed, and claimed. Some people resisted the trash can because they feared the loss of convenience. Others resisted because they feared the loss of income. Class played a role as well. Cleanliness rules were rarely felt equally across society. Wealthier neighborhoods often demanded order but exported the uglier parts of sanitation elsewhere. Meanwhile, poorer residents were blamed for disorder even when they had the fewest resources to comply with new standards. A trash can could be presented as a neutral public good, yet many people experienced it as part of a larger system of surveillance and discipline. Inspectors did not simply want cleaner streets, they wanted households to behave in approved ways. That included how people stored waste, when they placed it out, and whether they followed rules written by officials who often looked down on them. So when a household ignored the bin, that was not always laziness. Sometimes it was defiance. Sometimes it was mistrust. Sometimes it was pure practicality. Would you obey right away if the same officials who had failed to keep your street clean now told you that your family was the one that needed to change first? Landlords complicated the issue even more. In many buildings, tenants did not control the outside space, the storage area, or the maintenance rules. Owners wanted lower costs. Tenants wanted relief from dirt and smell. Building superintendents or caretakers often stood in the middle, trying to manage overflowing ash cans, yard heaps, stairwell complaints, and collection schedules that were irregular at best. A city could pass sanitation rules, but rules only mattered if someone on the ground enforced them. In crowded housing, nobody wanted to be the one blamed for overflow, leaks, or pests. Shared trash is still one of the fastest ways to start conflict in a building. In the 19th century, it was even worse. The design of early containers did not always help. Some were heavy, awkward, or poorly placed. Some were uncovered. Some rusted, some were easy to knock over. Separate ash cans and garbage receptacles could reduce certain problems, but they also added complexity. Households had to learn a new system and trust that collection workers would actually follow through. Without reliable pickup, the whole arrangement could backfire. A can full of waste that stayed too long became proof in the minds of many residents that the new method was pointless. This gets to the heart of the problem. A trash can only works well as part of a chain. The household has to store the waste. The building has to manage access. Workers have to collect it. The city has to move it somewhere else. If any link fails, the container stops looking like progress and starts looking like a nuisance. That is why early resistance was not simply ignorance facing modern wisdom. People were making judgments based on the systems they actually lived with. If collection was late, the can smelled. If the building was cramped, the can got in the way. If neighbors were careless, the can overflowed. If rats were already everywhere, the can did not feel like protection. Reformers saw the principle. Residents saw the daily inconvenience. Still, the old system had a bigger weakness that became impossible to ignore. Loose waste did not stay in one place, and growing cities were producing more of it than ever. More people meant more food scraps, more packaging, more broken goods, more coal ash, more street mess. and more chances for pests and disease to spread through dense neighborhoods. What looked like a personal disposal habit was becoming a citywide emergency. That pressure changed the argument. The trash can no longer had to seem pleasant. It only had to seem better than the alternative. And once streets grew more crowded, summers more foul, and sanitation fears more urgent, even reluctant cities began to accept that the old habits could not survive the scale of modern urban life. Resistance did not vanish overnight, but the balance was shifting. The bin was slowly moving from unwanted object to necessary compromise. And the real force behind that change was not household taste, it was urban pressure. Cities were getting too dense, too fast, and too dangerous to keep letting waste roam free. Once cities reached a certain size, the old disposal habits stopped looking old-fashioned and started looking impossible. What had worked or seemed to work in smaller communities failed badly in dense industrial neighborhoods, where thousands of people lived close together, burned coal every day, bought food in busy markets, and produced waste faster than weather, animals, or informal scavengers could make it disappear. The crisis was no longer about whether people liked the idea of a trash can. It was about whether a city could keep functioning without one. This was the moment when the humble bin became something much larger than a household object. It became part of public health. That may sound dramatic for such a plain item, but the logic was hard to escape. A city could not clean what it could not gather. It could not gather what was scattered, and it could not stop waste from scattering unless homes, shops, courtyards, apartment buildings, markets, and workshops first kept it contained. The trash can was not the final solution. It was the first workable step in a chain that made the rest of sanitation possible. By the 19th century, many fast-growing cities were already struggling under the weight of their own daily output. Horse manure piled up in transport corridors, coal ash poured out of homes, bakeries, and factories. Food waste rotted in alleys and side streets. Market leftovers spoiled quickly. Rain pushed garbage into gutters, where it mixed with mud and sewage. In hot weather, the smell could become unbearable. In poor neighborhoods with crowded housing and irregular cleanup, the buildup was even worse. Officials, doctors, reformers, and city administrators did not always agree on the exact science behind disease, especially in the earlier stages of urban reform. Germ theory took time to spread and gain full trust. But even before modern microbiology became widely accepted, people could still see patterns. Filthy streets tended to go with sickness, foul odors, insect swarms, contaminated surroundings, and repeated outbreaks of urban misery. You did not need a microscope to notice that piles of rotting waste made city life feel dangerous. And waste did more than smell bad. It fed rats, it fed flies. It gave insects and vermin places to breed, hide, and travel. Loose garbage acted like an open buffet for the urban creatures that thrived alongside human overcrowding. Once food scraps and other refuse sat exposed, pests could move through them freely, then move through houses, cellars, stables, and storage areas. Even when people blamed bad air more than microbes, they were still reacting to a real environmental threat. Waste left in the open made everything around it harder to keep healthy. The trash can changed that in a very practical way. It reduced access. That sounds simple because it is simple. A container places a wall between waste and the street. It keeps scraps in one place. It reduces how easily wind can spread debris, how easily animals can drag it away, and how quickly the road itself becomes a dumping surface. If the container has a lid or a secure cover, the effect is stronger. Not perfect, but stronger. Fewer open scraps mean fewer chances for rats, dogs, flies, and insects to turn every block into a feeding ground. Containment did not erase urban disease, but it reduced one of the daily ways filth multiplied. It also changed labor. This part is easy to miss. This part is easy to miss because sanitation work is often invisible when it succeeds. A worker collecting waste from a proper can lift, empty, or move a defined amount from a defined place. A worker dealing with loose refuse has to scrape, shovel, sweep, sort, and recover whatever the street has absorbed. That takes more time, more effort, and more workers. It also means more delay, and delay in sanitation is dangerous. Garbage does not pause while a city catches up. So once waste entered containers, collection could begin to follow routes, schedules, and systems. That was a major shift. Instead of chasing scattered trash after it had already spread, cities could start removing it at regular intervals from predictable points. Doorsteps, courtyards, alley bins, building receptacles, neighborhood collection spots, these became anchors in a new urban map of cleanliness. The bin helped turn sanitation from endless reaction into organized routine, and routine matters more than people think. A city becomes healthier not only through dramatic reforms, but through repeated ordinary actions that happen on time. Waste is collected on Monday, ash is removed on Wednesday, containers are returned, streets are swept after pickup, overflow is reported, routes are adjusted, new housing blocks are added to the system. The public rarely celebrates these steps because each one seems boring on its own. Yet together, they create the difference between a livable city and a filthy one. This is where the trash can became part of an invisible contract. Households were expected to contain their waste. In return, the city was expected to remove it. That contract was not always honored equally, and many neighborhoods were underserved or neglected. But the principle mattered. Urban sanitation was no longer just a private burden or a random improvisation. It became a coordinated exchange between daily domestic behavior and public infrastructure. At what point does a private habit become a public responsibility? That question sat at the center of modern city life. The answer, increasingly, was that waste disposal crossed the line the moment one household's habits affected the air, vermin, and safety of the entire block. The bin also helped cities separate categories of waste more clearly. Coal ash, kitchen refuse, salvageable materials, and street sweepings were not identical problems. Some municipalities developed systems that distinguished between them, while others pushed more mixed collection depending on local conditions. Either way, containment made management easier. Once waste had a place to go before removal, cities could begin to measure it, plan for it, regulate it, and design labor around it. Loose waste is chaos. Contained waste is a workload. That change had consequences far beyond the household. It affected carts, depots, disposal grounds, incineration plans, budgets, job structures, ordinances, and the timing of city operations. The trash can may look like the smallest piece in that chain, but remove it and the larger system weakens immediately. Without the first point of containment, every later step becomes slower, dirtier, and less reliable. And this is why the object deserves more credit than it gets. People often think of sanitation breakthroughs in terms of pipes, sewers, treatment systems, or famous reforms. Those things matter enormously, but solid waste posed its own challenge, and the answer was not just bigger machinery. It required a basic discipline of holding garbage in place until the city could take over. The bin did not solve sanitation alone. It made sanitation workable at human scale. By now, more residents were starting to see the difference. Streets with organized waste storage and pickup could be kept cleaner than streets where refuse still drifted loose through daily life. Markets became easier to manage. Building entrances became less chaotic. Alleyways became less attractive to scavenging animals. Collection crews could do more in less time. The results were not always dramatic on a single day, but over months and years the contrast became harder to deny. That did not mean cities had won. Overflow still happened. Corruption still happened. Strikes, storms, heat, poverty, and overcrowding could still push the system toward failure. But the direction had changed. Waste was no longer accepted as something that simply spread until somebody dealt with it. It was increasingly treated as a controlled problem that had to be contained quickly, moved regularly, and kept out of everyday public space. The bin had gone from unwanted nuisance to civic equipment, and once that shift took hold, people stopped seeing the container as an intrusion into home life and started seeing it as part of the city's operating system. What mattered now was not whether the can looked pleasant or modern. What mattered was that millions of people living close together needed a reliable way to keep yesterday's waste from becoming today's street. Once the trash can became normal, people stopped noticing how radical it really was. That is often the final stage of a successful invention. It enters daily life so completely that it disappears into the background. You pass it in the kitchen, by the curb, in the hallway of an apartment building, outside a school, beside a park bench, behind a restaurant, near a hospital loading dock, at the edge of an office break room, and almost never think about the fact that each one is standing guard over a very old urban problem. But cities still depend on that quiet guard every single day. By the early modern age of sanitation systems, the bin had become more than a container for unwanted scraps. It had become a tool for behavior. It taught people where waste belonged, when it should leave the home, and how private habits fit into a larger public order. That is one reason this simple object mattered so much. It did not just hold trash. It trained city life. Think about what happens when a society agrees that waste must go into a designated container. The agreement sounds small, but it changes a chain of actions. Instead of tossing refuse wherever there is room, households begin to gather it. Buildings start assigning storage spots. Collection crews know where to go. Municipal departments can build schedules around fixed points. Streets stay clearer between pickups. Rats have fewer easy meals in open piles. Fires from scattered combustible waste become less common. Public spaces are no longer treated as backup dumping grounds. The can helps turn a messy human instinct into a predictable civic routine. And routines are the hidden architecture of cities. People often imagine modern urban life as something built by towering projects. Bridges, railroads, sewer tunnels, reservoirs, electric grids, highways, apartment blocks. All of those matter. But large cities are also held together by smaller rules and smaller objects that keep daily life from tipping into disorder. The trash can belongs in that category. It stands at the point where the personal meets the municipal. One household uses it, but the whole city benefits when that household does. That is why the object spread far beyond the private home. Once cities embraced organized waste control, containers appeared everywhere people gathered or worked. Apartment buildings needed shared receptacles. Factories and workshops needed designated places for scraps and debris. Schools and offices needed bins for paper, food remains, and everyday rubbish. Street corners and public parks needed receptacles because waste does not disappear just because someone leaves the house. A city full of people on the move also needed places for temporary disposal in public view. In other words, the trash can helped redraw the map of responsibility. Homeowners, tenants, landlords, shopkeepers, porters, janitors, and sanitation workers, inspectors, and city departments all became part of one broad system. That system was not always fair. Some neighborhoods got better service than others. Poor areas were often left with slower collection and worse conditions, but the underlying principle had changed for good. Waste was no longer something the city could ignore until the smell became unbearable. It was something that had to be managed continuously, and the bin was the first station in that process. This also changed how people thought about cleanliness itself. Cleanliness was no longer only about sweeping the visible floor or washing the visible body. It became tied to containment, timing, and removal. A room might look tidy, but if its waste had no proper destination, the larger environment would still suffer. A street might be swept in the morning, but if loose garbage returned by evening, appearances meant little. The trash can helped introduce a modern idea that now feels obvious. Cleanliness is not just about what you wipe away. It is about where you send what you no longer want. That shift had a surprisingly deep effect on urban behavior. Once bins became common, people started expecting waste to be hidden, held, and taken away on schedule. Overflow became a sign of failure. Missed pickup became a political problem. Piles left in the open came to feel shocking in places that had once accepted them as normal. The object changed expectations, and when expectations change, daily life changes with them. You can still see this in moments when the system breaks down. A sanitation strike, a flood, a storm, a transport collapse, a labor dispute, or a sudden surge in population can overwhelm collection systems in a matter of days. When that happens, the illusion of effortless cleanliness vanishes almost immediately. Bags pile up, containers overflow, odors return, pests move in fast. Streets feel less orderly, then less safe, then less livable. People are reminded, sometimes very quickly, that urban hygiene is not a natural state. It is a maintained condition. It depends on containers, schedules, labor, and infrastructure all working together. That may be the clearest proof of how much the trash can help save cities. You notice it most when its system fails. The object also helped cities survive growth. As populations expanded and consumption changed, the amount and variety of solid waste increased. More packaging, more disposable materials, more commercial activity, more traffic, more public gathering, more institutional life. All of that produced more rubbish. Without standardized ways to hold and move waste, every wave of urban growth would have pushed streets back toward chaos. The trash can did not eliminate the burden of waste, but it made that burden manageable enough for larger and denser forms of city life to continue, and this is where the title's promise fully pays off. Trash cans helped save cities because they turned loose waste into controlled waste. That is the whole trick, and it is bigger than it sounds. Loose waste spreads, leaks, rots, burns, attracts, and contaminates. Controlled waste waits. It can be counted, lifted, moved, sorted, burned, buried, recycled, or processed. A city cannot do much with trash that is everywhere. It can do a great deal with trash that stays where it is supposed to stay, until the next step in the system begins. The strange part is that people once resisted this object for reasons that were not entirely foolish. They worried about smell, pests, inconvenience, cost, and interference. In some cases, they were right to worry, especially when collection was poor or housing was cramped. But the larger city problem kept growing until the old habits became far more dangerous than the new inconvenience. Over time, the trash can won not because it was elegant, but because the alternative was urban breakdown. That is what makes the object so interesting. It looks passive, but it represents control. It looks boring, but it sits at the center of an endless civic struggle against disorder. It looks domestic, but it helps support public health. It looks small, but it belongs to one of the largest systems any city runs every day. Would millions of people be able to live close together without some version of this object? Not for long. So much of city life depends on keeping certain things out of sight, out of the street, and out of contact until the system can take them away. The trash can does exactly that, quietly, constantly, without praise. So the next time you drop something into a bin and walk away without thinking about it, remember what that ordinary motion replaced. Open heaps, rot in the gutter, ash blown across the block, animals tearing through scraps, streets acting as the city's accidental dumping ground. A daily fight against waste that no crowded society could afford to lose forever. That plain container by the curb or under the sink is not just a household object. It is one of the reasons modern urban life can function at all. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe and leave a like, and tell me in the comments which ordinary object you want to see uncovered next. Because some of the biggest changes in history did not arrive as monuments. They arrived as everyday things people almost refused to live with.